Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore Presents. In this episode, I'm going to be chatting to James Wright of Triskele Heritage, who's an award-winning buildings archaeologist who has 2 decades of professional experience of ferreting around in people's cellars, hunting through their attics, and digging up their gardens. He hopes to find meaningful truths about how ordinary and extraordinary folk lived their lives in the medieval period. He's the author of the popular Medieval Mythbusting blog, and his book Historic Building Mythbusting was released in June 2024. In this chat, we're going to explore what buildings archaeology actually is, some popular myths about historic buildings, and we'll be doing a little bit of debunking as well, and also what debunking these myths can tell us about folklore. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to Fabulous Folklore.
Hello, thanks very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be able to sit down and record this with you.
And to talk about buildings and all kinds of fun stuff as well.
Yeah. I mean, the kind of intersection of archaeology and history and folklore with architecture is definitely something that I'm really excited and juiced about talking with you.
Excellent. So before we go any further, how would you actually describe buildings archaeology to someone who hadn't come across it before? Because most people will probably hear archaeology and think like time team. So how
Hmm.
does that work with buildings?
Well, I suppose even taking the time team analogy there, even when they were doing their 3-day excavations back in the classic era of time team, quite often, and you can still see this in the old recordings, they are also looking at standing buildings as well, where you've got that intersection between something which is still extant and something which has essentially been demolished and is just, as Eddie Izzard put it, a series of small walls. So they did actually have buildings archaeologists on it back in the 90s, 2000s too, many of whom were quite influential in, I suppose, inspiring me to look into architecture archaeologically. But the way that buildings archaeology works essentially is to take all of those archaeological procedures, the very forensic methodologies of recording, and actually applying them to something which is above ground. We tend to use all of the tools in the toolkit. So we'll throw archival research at a building. We will make archaeological observations, which we can then record using annotations and notes, using drawings, using photographs, and we'll be spotting things like the form, the function, the fabric, the materials, setting, context, and of course the dating and phasing of bits of buildings. And then when we really need to get something a bit more scientific, an absolutely specific date, if it works, and it doesn't always, we can also throw tree ring dating, the science of dendrochronology of building too, for the timber framed elements of it. So there's different aspects that we can use, maybe not all of them, but we can throw quite a bit at a structure to understand it. And one of the reasons we might want to do this is that, quite frankly, 95% of historic buildings have never been recorded, certainly not in a meaningful sense. They've not been surveyed. They've maybe given a cursory look by a listing inspector, but they won't have had any detailed research. And as a result of that, you end up with quite a lot of stories, rumours, hearsay, myths, and legends forming. That's actually what I've been pulling my career towards in recent months and years, looking at those stories which grow up about historic buildings and really questioning and challenging whether or not they're actually true using the disciplines of buildings archaeology.
Mhm. So how did you actually get into that? Because I always think it sounds like a really fascinating thing. Like, oh, I wish I'd known about that as a job. So how did you get into it?
Really by accident. I mean, when I went to university in the mid 90s to study straightforward archaeology, I kind of thought that what I was interested in and what I would end up specializing in was possibly something to do with the archaeology of Iron Age religion and ritual, or possibly the early medieval migration period, what used to be called the Dark Ages, which definitely isn't anymore. We stay away from that as a phrase, but that whole kind of mysterious period of the fifth, sixth centuries, where trying to work out what was actually going on across Europe, and then that was certainly what I was interested in when I was, 18, 19. But at the end of my first year and really into my second year, I met this fella who was teaching at the University of Nottingham called Philip Dixon. And he was one of those fellas that had appeared on Time Team. And he was one of the guys that they got in as their consultant, their specialist, to talk about standing architecture and or castles. And Philip taught these three amazing modules on ecclesiastical architecture, on castles and great houses, and on vernacular architecture. And to be honest with you, by midway through my second year, I decided that actually I wanted to do something very much like Philip. I wanted to look at the archaeology of standing buildings. I was absolutely entranced by these procedures, and I'd always liked architecture anyway, days out at country houses or, you know, ruined monasteries and the like. And so kind of Philip gave me the bug for it. I made a promise to myself that by the time I was 30, I'd be working in some aspect of medieval buildings. To be honest with you, I got a bit lucky and I was 22 by the time I got my first job, which was actually a conservation stonemason, but it was working at places like Nottingham Castle, Woolerton Hall and Newstead Abbey, which were medieval and early modern buildings. So although it wasn't the standard archaeological job, it was connected to the heritage sector and the conservation of buildings. So I kind of got lucky and then subsequently moved back into archaeology with initially a project looking at local castles in my area, which I ended up writing my first book on. So that was kind of the route I took. It was kind of the interest in buildings archaeology, then the opportunity to do conservation work, and then a community archaeology project looking at local castles. And I've kind of always drifted towards the archaeology of buildings since that period. But really, I've been mucking around with buildings for 25 years now.
Nice. It's always good when people fall into jobs and they end up being something that they actually like doing.
Yeah. I mean, I like the theory of my job. Quite often now being self-employed, I don't like the actuality of it. I certainly wouldn't recommend my pay packet to anybody at all. I certainly wouldn't recommend the stress and pressure of trying to find enough work and trying to ensure the cash flow to be able to pay myself at the end of every month. But when I do have the work, it is probably one of the best jobs I could possibly imagine. Just wish that it paid better and that people paid on time.
Well, yes, there is that. So how does that relate to folklore then? Because obviously, you know that obviously folklore is my focus here, and I know you've talked about like the myths of buildings, but does folklore come up a lot in what you're actually doing if you're doing a survey, or is it one of those things that comes up more than you expected to?
I think the latter. It comes up virtually every time I do a survey because as a result of the kind of lack of research into architecture, there forms what you might call a knowledge vacuum. So because there isn't lots of evidence or lots of facts which can be tangibly known about a structure, you get stories forming about either the buildings or bits of buildings or features within buildings. And these stories definitely fall into the realm of hearsay, rumour and folklore. They kind of permit insights into the way that people think about buildings, which are often affected by, I suppose you might say, mass interpretation. So if a particular feature has been interpreted in that way across the board, people tend to believe it. And it can be things like stories such as the grooves on the walls of churches, which are vertical grooves, very, very common, particularly found around the porch area, and they're interpreted as being the result of 100 Years' War archers who are sharpening their arrows or possibly their swords against the building before they either go off to practice archery or go off to war itself. And this is a very, very common interpretation. You can find it on the handboards at the back of churches, in the little guidebooks and leaflets. Church wardens will repeat it to you if they're in the building, and tour guides love it as well. Sometimes it can even be found on interpretation panels. So that's just sort of one example of how a particular story is repeated. If you get these vertical grooves on the walls of churches, that will be the common interpretation. That's notwithstanding the fact that there's absolutely no evidence to back it up. It is widely popularly believed and definitely falls into the realm of folklore. Now, just because it is folklore doesn't mean that there isn't a truth intrinsic to it. So folklore, I think we can agree, permits insight into psychologies and emotions. It might not take us to the real moment of the lived reality in the medieval or post-medieval period, but it can certainly tell us how individuals or communities or societies think about a building. And in the instance of the Arrowstone story, this tells us that there's tremendous local pride in the idea of soldiery, in the idea of practicing archery to then go off and fight in these enormous battles during the Hundred Years' War, which we hear about in schoolrooms, on TV, and plays. I'm thinking of Crécy, Poitiers, and of course the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, which is such a massive, monumental moment in English history that it's almost something that's too big to touch and comprehend. And yet, these stories of the soldiers, the archers practicing, marking up the building to sharpen their arrows before going and fighting in these great battles that we all know so much about, is a way of localizing that. It's also a way of talking about the pride in conquest and victory. And I think it says more about the post-medieval moment than it does the medieval. Because in reality, these things have nothing to do with medieval archers at all. There's good evidence from 19th century anthropology, but also in the writings of medieval chroniclers themselves, which explain that these marks in that particular moment were created by parishioners who were concerned about catching the fever. And what they would do is scrape the walls of holy buildings, collect the stone powder in a vessel, mix it up with holy water, and then drink it as a potion to charm away the fever. And there's good evidence for that, both anthropologically in Europe in the 19th century, but also in the writings of chroniclers from the Venerable Bede onwards, all the way through the medieval period, with direct references to this happening in England. So there you can kind of see the intersection of the archaeological feature, the folklore which explains that feature, but also, and this is what I'm really interested in, the story behind the story. So although we now know that it's got nothing to do with archery, and we can understand that actually what we're really looking at is kind of white magic, Christian white magic, it also tells us something about the preoccupations of the communities which create these stories. So there's a forgetfulness about Catholicism and Catholic rituals and practices during the post-medieval period. And as a result of that forgetfulness of what actually created these marks, we need to therefore come up with an explanation as a society. And that society, which is massively fixated on war and warfare, and I'm thinking about the especially 18th and really the 19th century, which is when these stories about archers really take off. This is the period when the British Empire is at its height. And again, it's telling you something about communities in the 19th century and their pride in conquest and empire, rather than what was really going on in the medieval period. And again, it's that kind of environment that I've been looking at in the book Historic Building Mythbusting to understand the stories behind the stories.
Yeah, because that's one of the things I think folklore does really well. The fact that you can't ever really look at anything as an either or. It's always got to be a both and that you can absolutely hear a myth and believe it, and then somebody will tell you the actual information, and then rather than pushing back against it like some people will, you can then just kind of install that belief alongside the other one and go, well, I know this one's wrong, but I can still know that people thought that while also knowing this new one. And it was really funny because I know one of the myths that you mentioned is the one about the staircases and castles, and I'll let you explain that one better. And it was really funny because I know Dave at Newcastle Castle did an entire episode on their podcast about why that didn't work. And it was really funny because I'd never even stopped to think, does this staircase go clockwise or anti-clockwise? I hate spiral staircases. So I wasn't really bothered one way or the other. But it was funny how when you then stop and think about it logically, you're like, oh, actually, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. But yeah, I'll let you explain that one though, because I think that the staircases one is a really interesting one.
Well, I look at a whole heap of stories
Yeah.
about principally medieval buildings. I've already touched in some detail about the Arrowstone story in the last question that you asked me. I also look at things like claims to be the oldest pub in the country, or persistent rumours of secret passages underneath the landscape, that there are certain timber frame buildings which are constructed from wood that has been reclaimed from warships. But as you've asked me to elaborate on, there's this persistent story that all castle spiral staircases turn clockwise to advantage right-handed defenders. The idea being that if you're attacking uphill, your sword swing is going to be impeded by the newel post, which is the column that goes up the middle of the spiral staircase, whereas the guy who's fighting down will have plenty of room to kind of swing in there. And this is probably the one thing that everybody knows about castles. Despite castles being a massive feature of the tourist industry, with so many open to the public, very little information seems to be instilled within the what you might call the national or the public consciousness about how these buildings actually functioned. But I think most people agree that they're all defensive military fortifications, and you've only got to walk into the gift shop in any castle and they're absolutely filled with little model trebuchets and little models of castles with knights all over them, and plastic swords for the kids, and helmets and shields, and some of them even sell actual weaponry for adults as well, reproduction weaponry for adults. So everything we're kind of told about castles is that they are defensive fortifications. And when you go into a lot of castles, again, that's portrayed in the guidebook, in the tour guide spiel, and on interpretation panels. There's a big focus on battles and sieges and knights and armor. But in reality, that type of militaristic thinking was prevalent from the beginning of castle studies in the middle of the 19th century up until probably the 1980s, early 1990s. So for about 120 years, that was the orthodoxy, and was principally being driven by the fact that most of the people who had looked at castles from a professional point of view tended to be men with a military background. So Viollet-le-Duc, the French castle specialist, was a military engineer at the siege of Paris. The first person to excavate a Motte and Bailey castle in this country was Pitt Rivers, who was a general in the British Army for 32 years. Alan Brown, who was the first best-selling castle specialist, dozens of books which sold, very, very well. If I could sell like 1% of what he did, I'd be all right. I'd be sorted. But again, he had this glittering career in the Second World War. So they were all looking at these buildings and thinking, oh, well, they must be military. And this sort of story grows up that even the spiral staircases are geared towards a defensibility. And yet there's absolutely no evidence for that from the medieval period at all. There's no evidence for this kind of last-ditch fight on the staircases where the defenders are desperately trying to ward off the attackers coming up the stairs one by one, and hoping that they'll all be right-handed. There's just no evidence for it. There's no evidence for a single fight on a spiral staircase at all from the medieval period. And that actually what we're seeing is this Victorian obsession with the militarism of castles. Now, castles were way more complicated than this. They are the most complex buildings that were ever created in the medieval period. They have lots to do with ritual and religion and hierarchy and economy and landscape and lordship, principally showing off and demonstrating your power and might. And what we actually find is that spiral staircases are only found in the poshest bits of castles, and they are part of your status display to show that you know about these really quite high status features. And so there isn't an element of defensibility about them at all, because that's not their function. They're a high status mechanism to access upper chambers, and the higher up you go in a castle tower, usually the posher the chambers will get as well, one after the other. what John Goodall, the castle specialist, refers to as gathering magnificence, which I think is a wonderful phrase to describe how chamber after chamber, as you go up a tower, they will just get smarter and more elaborate and more flamboyant. So this idea that they're there for defensive nature just doesn't really stack up. But again, you could sort of stop there and say, well, actually, the myth is debunked. But in reality, what I try and do with my research is to get under the skin of the stories. It really is. The book is a love letter to folklore. I want to understand the development of the stories. And I got lucky with this one in that I was able to do an earlier citation exercise and found the man that actually invented the myth, which absolutely bamboozled me. It bowled me over to be able to sort of draw up a photograph of this guy that actually invented the story that has become common knowledge, and to understand that actually he was an art critic from 1902 and that this story did not exist before the opening of the 20th century. And then kind of understanding that this art critic was obsessed with spirals because he wrote a book on spirals in nature and art, it's called. And then he was obsessed with left-handedness throughout his writing. And you might ask, well, why is he so obsessed with left-handedness? Well, he thought that left-handers excelled at whatever they did. And the reason that he thought that is because he'd seen two left-handed fencers at an expo in London, and they absolutely destroyed and defeated all comers with the old epee. You know, they absolutely battered everybody, and he thought they were absolutely wonderful. And he goes into this big long digression, long discussion about these two really obscure fencers. And then you look at his biography, and you realise that this guy, who's called Theodore Andrea Cook, was absolutely obsessed with fencing, and that his life was all about fencing. He might have made his money as an art critic, but what he really wanted to be was a fencer. And that he founded Oxford University's fencing club. He was the fencing columnist for the Daily Telegraph. He was a founder and a committee member of the Amateur Fencing Association, and he picked fencers for the British Olympic team. So when you pull all those things together, the obsession with spirals, left-handedness, and fencing, essentially sword fighting, there can only be the conclusion that this man invented the story as his way of understanding a castle staircase, but based on the militarism of the Victorian period. So it's another one of those tales that comes out of the pride in military victories and the empire.
Would you? I know when I was reading the book, I was like, "Oh." For some of his stories. So did debunking any of them really disappoint you, or because you can hold like the myth and the reality in your head at the same time, just kind of go, oh well, but it's still cool that we'll have the myth even if it's wrong?
I didn't feel disappointed by any of the debunkings at all, because I think that the truth is always fundamentally more interesting than the hearsay or the rumor. I again, as I said in the last section, I really like getting under the skin of the stories to understand their development. And I think for me, that was where I personally got excited. You know, okay, we can look at the story, we can set it up, we can look at who's repeated it, why they've repeated it, possibly why it's been so popular. We can then debunk it and offer reasons why it might not be truthful. But then for me, the real joy was then going one step further and trying to explain the development of the story, setting it in its wider context, looking at it against the background of the period and the people that had created it. And that, in all instances, whether it's when I was writing my blog, or whether when I've delivered it as a talk online or in person, or when I was writing the book, that has always been the bit for me that garnered the most joy and the most interest. And I hope that also my readers will find that as well, that it's actually the story behind the story which is the most interesting and significant part of the exercise, if you know what I mean. And certainly that discovery that Theodore Cook, writing in 1902, was actually literally the smoking gun is something I never thought I'd get to identify. I just thought it'll probably be it might have come out of the more general background and eventually was recorded. That there was a kind of an oral tradition which had developed and eventually somebody had recorded it. But I didn't think that the man's biography would be so compelling to explain that actually he wasn't the first person to record something which people were already talking about as in an oral folklore, but actually he invented it. And that was the biggest surprise for me. And again, for me personally, there could be no disappointment in that kind of lightning bolt research moment. There was a real excitement for me when that happened.
Mm-hmm. All that being said, are there any of the myths that you actually really wish were true?
Well, to be honest with you, there was one that I looked at. I look at, broadly speaking, 9 throughout the book. There's 9 chapters and, broadly speaking, 9 myths. There was one that did turn out to be true, and that was the section on ship timbers reused in historic buildings. Now, this is considered to be something which virtually every timber frame building is accused of being reclaimed from a ship or a warship, prevalently a warship. It's quite often that the ships will be identified as having either fought against or for the Spanish Armada, or quite often that it's one of Horatio Nelson's warships and then tacitly fought at Trafalgar in the storytelling. It's a rare timber frame building which will not have one of those stories attached to it. And that's particularly true of pubs, if they're timber frame, that there will be something on the website or on a leaflet or on the back of a menu in a pub, which will try and link it to one of those moments. I'm thinking about, in particular, there's 2 that I draw attention to in the book. There's the Old White Bear at West Norwood in Yorkshire, which is said to have been constructed from timbers which were reclaimed from a ship called the White Bear, which fought for the English against the Spanish Armada in 1588. And then also there's a pub in Brassington in Derbyshire called the Old Gate Inn, which again is said to be built from reclaimed ship timbers, but in that instance they've been taken from the Spanish Armada, from the wrecks of the Armada, and then inserted into the building. Now there's no evidence for that for either building. They're actually both buildings which significantly post-date the Spanish Armada, one being mid-18th century and one being mid-17th century. So I think it's a bit unrealistic to expect these timbers to have hung around for the best part of 100 years, really. But nevertheless, these stories are really, really common, but there is a grain of truth to some of them. And that I have actually, in my career, it's only happened a couple of times, but I have seen genuine ship timbers reclaimed in ancient buildings. So the first time I saw it was in a huge late 16th century estate barn at Waxham in Norfolk. And this has really big tie beams which span the structure and hold up the roof. And these tie beams are all rectangular in section, apart from one, which is clearly inserted. It's a later repair, probably popped in the 18th century, and that's cylindrical in section. And this solid cylinder of timber, has got tar all over it, and within the tar you can actually see the marks of ropes within it too. This is almost certainly a reclaimed spar or mast from a ship. But Waxham is literally spitting distance of the North Sea. So it's possible to imagine that after a great storm or a shipwreck, that something like that could have washed up on the shore. The local people might have thought that's a really useful timber. By the way, have you seen that horrible crack in the tie beam in the barn over there? Let's have that and we'll insert that. That seems a reasonable account of what may have happened somewhere in the post-medieval period, but it's so close to the sea. There's literally a short stretch of land and then the sand dunes at Waxham. The only other time I've seen it was 4 timbers which have been reused from what was described by the carpentry consultant that I sent the photographs to as from a large boat or a small ship. And they were what were called futtocks, which are the timbers which form the rib shape from the keel of a ship, and they kind of stand out a mile because they're much bigger than you would imagine that the timbers would be in a land building. So these were being reused as the bracket for a fireplace, bresamer, for a collar, in a roof structure, and also as two lintels above doorways as well. And in all cases, these timbers were much bigger than you would expect to see in those locations. And they were also had many more pegs within them, or peg holes. And those pegs were massive, 3 and 4 times the size that you would expect to see. And many of them not actually doing anything useful at all in the context where they were found. And all of those things are archaeologically what you might call red flags for the reuse of ship timbers. And the reason that they have bigger timbers and bigger pegs is to withstand the pressures at sea, the wind and the rain, etc., and the waves. So there I saw them at Whitby, in a small cottage. It's now a holiday let, so you could hire it if you wanted to. 45 Cliff Street at Whitby. But that looks straight down into the harbour, which of course has a proud tradition of shipbuilding and shipbreaking. And again, it's another site where it's visible, where you've got the origins of these timbers. And realistically, we're not finding ship timbers inland at all, because it was just a huge effort to drag these massive timbers on roads which were terrible. So we're not finding them inland. I think what's led to the creation of this story is that there was a little bit of a fad in the early 20th century for architects in that kind of Art Deco period, also who were building inner arts and crafts style, reusing ship timbers. There was a kind of a romanticism to it, because it was the last of the tall ships which were going into buildings such as the Royal Oak at Halifax, or Liberties of London, or the entire back end of the captain's cabin from HMS Ganges, which was basically bolted on to an otherwise Art Deco hotel on Burr Island in Devon, which then became the most popular and favourite of hotels for clientele such as Noel Coward and Agatha Christie. So it kind of, that then leads people to assume that it was done more often in the past than it was. But that's the one time where I found that there was a grain of truth to the stories. So it didn't even have to be wishful thinking that I just wished that a myth could be true, because one of them was. It's just that lots and lots of other buildings where it said that the timbers come from ships, it's not true at all. What concerns me about this myth is that it kind of denigrates working class history, and it kind of says, well, actually, we're not hearing about the cyclical management of woodlands to provide good quality building timber for honest carpenters. It's this assumption that it must have been brought from a ship. And again, I think also because there's that element of the pride in naval victory, namely that the ship has come from something involved with the Spanish Armada or involved with Nelson's ships. Again, it speaks of that pride in the English or the British Navy, which again speaks of conquest and empire. And so many of these stories, because they were, shall we say, invented or developed during principally the Victorian era, do speak of that pride in empire. And there's that kind of dark heart to many of the stories.
Do you find that even when you've gone to such great lengths to sort of debunk a myth and explain where it came from, and then also look at the more interesting story underneath, people just go, nope, I'm going to believe the original myth, and just completely dismiss everything that you've just said?
Yeah, 100%. Every single story that I've debunked in the book, people will still cling to it and will push back. A lot of medieval reenactors don't like the debunking of the spiral staircase story, because they say, oh, well, we fought up a spiral staircase, so it must be true. We've found that actually it would have an advantage. But there are other reenactors who have said, well, that's actually rubbish, because many of these spaces are too tight. You wouldn't be able to swing and slash a sword anyway. You want a short stabbing weapon. They've also pointed out actually that the guy who's below has the advantage, because he's got access to the sort of feet and ankles and nether regions of the guy who's higher up, and the guy who's higher up is at a disadvantage because he's sort of swinging down and he will off balance himself. So there's even disagreement in the reenactor community, but lots of people are still really beholden to these tales. And they are so popular that one book of 80,000 words published by a relatively obscure archaeologist is definitely not going to have the impact of stopping these stories dead. Even when I've published popular magazine articles or my blog or whatever. You know, there are just people who will not be persuaded at all because they're absolutely in love with the stories, and they kind of struggle to overcome that there is new thinking and new ways of looking at it which set it into context. And I can kind of understand that because many of these stories are sold principally by figures of authority. So in our modern context, many of these stories are repeated by mainstream media journalists or on clickbait websites. So, for example, ship timber myths have been repeated within the last few weeks by clickbait websites that have kind of 2.2 million followers on social media. Now, my own social media is only about 14,000 on Twitter. So I will always struggle to get the numbers with the rebuttals. So there's figures of authority, and some of those figures of authority can also include people that have told the stories interpersonally, and that can include people such as teachers and builders and curators and tour guides and local historians. Also, I think there's a strong emotional pull for the stories, particularly when it's been told by a beloved family member, often an elder male to a younger child. And it often is that male aspect as well, that kind of patrician-like nature to the stories. And just anecdotally, the spiral staircase story was repeated when I was stood on at the foot of the Ludlow Tower stairs the Mortimer's Tower at Ludlow Castle. When I was stood at the foot of the stairs there, I heard that story repeated 6 times in under 5 minutes, and it was always a male repeating it. It seems to be a bit of a boy's story as well. So it's so commonly believed, and there is that kind of emotional pull to it. And researchers have certainly understood, sociological researchers, that if there is a kind of a tugging on the heartstrings in the way that you tell a story, that will help it to fly. And sometimes it can just be that emotional attachment to that's the story that Grandad told me, so it can't possibly be untrue. And this is something which I think this acceptance of a story when you're very, very young and when your mind is still forming, the first stories that you are told stick the longest. This idea of childhood within folklore and myth making is very, very potent and very strong. And you can see this in stories of secret passages, for example, where it's said that there's a hidden tunnel between 2 buildings. And again, often there's that repetition by an older relative to a young child. And then in the telling of it, it will often be repeated that, well, we know that's there because my cousin's mother's third child's best mate went down there when they were a kid 40 or 50 years ago, and they were playing down it, but then the council discovered that kids were in there and they thought it was dangerous, so they had to block it up, and that's why we can't see it anymore. That is such a common feature in the storytelling of secret passage folklore. So kind of the way that these stories develop means that actually many people are highly resistant to the debunking and actually want to believe what they were told as a child.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that, because I remember when I came across the fact that the Ring of Rosies rhyme has absolutely nothing to do with the plague, and shared that as part of an episode on plague folklore. And I remember somebody on Twitter really pushing back against what I was saying until I sent the link by the original author, who was a man. He was quite happy to take it from him, but wouldn't take it from me. And I was
Right.
like,
Yeah.
And even then, I've had people leave comments on that episode going, "No, Ring of Rosies is based on the plague," and
Yeah.
I'm thinking, I've literally just debunked it in the episode. Why are you continuing to repeat it? Like, that just seems a bit like a waste of your time and mine.
Yeah, and there are people that you're just never going to change their minds on at all because they are so beholden to the way that the story's been told to them. there's somebody out there that's involved in conservation that anytime I talk about burn marks, tear-shaped burn marks on buildings, which are widely interpreted as being the result of accidental candle burns, but we've got some very compelling evidence are actually the result of deliberate human behavior connected to apotropaic practices to drive away the threat of evil. And there's very, very compelling evidence for that. But there's one particular conservation specialist who refers to me, and this is probably the most polite thing that I can repeat. He refers to me as a pratodemic, because he sees me as not having the practical knowledge to be able to actually interpret these things. There's other people that I've got into rows with online. There was a fella called Philip who would not have it that the Bingley Arms in West Yorkshire could not possibly be anything other than the oldest public house in the country, dated to 953 AD. He, unsurprisingly, was local to West Yorkshire and drinks in that pub quite a bit. And he came out with all sorts of crazy phrasing to sort of try and discredit me, but settled on the hill that he wanted to die on was, "You've never even been there. There's no photographs of you having a pint in there. How can you know that this isn't the oldest pub?" Well, actually, I have been in there. I have had a pint in there. I just chose not to take a photograph of myself there because it ain't the oldest pub. Because basically we know how old it is. It's mid-18th century. There's even a date stone to prove it. The attribution of the Bingley Arms being the oldest pub only dates back to the 1970s, and it's entirely just plucked out of the air as a marketing ploy. But there are some people that will get desperately, nastily personal about any attempt to debunk. So I'm massively sympathise with you with this Ring of Roses business and offer you my greatest solidarity, because I think there is definitely a sexual element to it, a misogynistic element to it as well. And I suppose I'm privileged enough to be a middle-aged white man, so I can sometimes overcome some of that just by nature of not being a woman. So yeah, I'm very disheartened to hear that you're experiencing that.
I mean, that was a long time ago now, and I think thankfully a lot of the people that I attract to the podcast are happy to learn new things, and they want to learn new things, and they will be like, "Oh my God, I always thought that was true," but like you said, that's even cooler. So obviously that's always quite nice. But you also mentioned secret tunnels, and I can't let that one slide, because yeah, I must admit, and I remember I mentioned this I think in a message to you, that when I was reading a section about like monks in particular and secret tunnels, about the idea that monks were like having these secret liaisons left, right, and centre, and they were building. And you think, when you consider where most monasteries are out in the middle of nowhere, nobody would have seen them going anywhere anyway. And the thing that always fascinates me is we had at one stage, I think it was 3, possibly 4 monasteries and a convent in the city centre, which, if anyone's familiar with Newcastle city centre now, is quite hard to comprehend.
Yep.
But there's a ghost of a nun who walks towards Blackfriars. So if she's walking around at street level, why would there have been a secret tunnel? Like, just a ghost story then debunks it. But why are we so obsessed with monks and secret tunnels in particular?
You're absolutely right to kind of spot this connection with Catholics and Catholic buildings, which was a strain of the storytelling about secret passages under the landscape, which was such a strong strand that I really had to look into that in more detail. And a lot of the storytelling which involves secret passages grows up again in that post-medieval period, post-Reformation. And really, I think it's responding to the notion that there was this tremendous attempt at propaganda by the government after the Reformation to essentially trash and tarnish the reputation of the Catholics. This idea that they must have been up to no good. These are now kind of seen as the enemy within, the idea of the Catholic plot, which is such a big thing in the later 16th and very early 17th century. That those Catholics must have been up to no good. They must have been subversive and seditious. And they would kind of use any means necessary to kind of undermine the reputation of Catholics. And you can kind of see this in the writings in the lead up to the Reformation, where you get the surveys of the monasteries by Cromwell's commissioners, who are reporting all kinds of nefarious behaviour, from sodomy to lesbian trysts to widespread drunkenness to just eating too much to all of the monks being asleep all of the time and badly run estates, etc. And this is obviously intended to be very sort of scandalous and titillating, you might say. And of course, these are widely available, widely published, and there's a great understanding of this in that period. And there's particular fixation on sex and drunkenness as well. So this idea that the secret passages, in particular with a sexual context, which you've kind of drawn attention to, the idea of the nun who is walking to the monk's monastery. Well, why is she going there? There's kind of an implicit nature to the story that there must be something a bit naughty here, and you get this in folklore of. For example, St Albans Abbey is said to be connected to Sopwell Nunnery, again, monks and nuns, secret of access, and all of a sudden you're kind of into the name of the rose here, really, aren't you? Where you've got the monk shagging the peasant girl and all that kind of thing. There's stories about Canterbury Cathedral being connected to brothels in the town, and then this idea of drunkenness. So many pubs are said to be connected to the vicarage or the church or the monastery or the cathedral. I'm thinking of the Three Tuns in Norwich being connected to the cathedral, or there's one of the pubs in York which is connected to the Minster, or in Wells it's the Swan Hotel to the cathedral. It's a huge variation in the stories, but again, there's this idea that they're all drunk all of the time, and you can actually see this developing in the writings of Puritans in the later 16th century, that drunkenness equates badness. They kind of early temperance writers, such as Philip Stubbs, who describes there just being too many pubs. People are falling out of alehouses and they're struttering and stammering and staggering and reeling backwards and forwards, and even describes them throwing up in the street or just being so drunk that they're urinating under the tables. And you can kind of see that, again, drunkenness equals bad behavior. And of course, if you can then link that to Catholics as well. And again, I think that what you're seeing here is this trashing of the Catholic reputation, this idea that they would have needed secretive access to get up to all of the naughty things that those Catholics were undoubtedly doing. Then you get another element of the secret passage story, which is kind of often predicated on that tacitly, namely the idea of the neo-Gothic novel. It's not a Gothic novel without a secret passage, and they're usually linked to a Catholic building somewhere. So The Castle of Otranto, Horace Walpole, the very first Gothic novel, 1764, has a secret passage which the heroine of the piece escapes from a castle into, and she comes up in the local parish church. Well, again, why does the parish church and the castle need to be linked in this context? So it's a big thing there in the 18th and 19th century storytelling, and then that kind of continues through into the modern novel as well. So it's not a famous five novel by Enid Blyton unless it's got a secret passage within it, and that peppers Enid Blyton's writing. It's there in The Wind in the Willows. It's there also in the writings of Alan Garner, where 25% of the action of The Weirdstone of Brisingamen takes place in copper mines underneath Alderley Edge, with all sorts of strange and curious creatures populating that space. So we're kind of predisposed to believe in the reality of secret passages because we've kind of grown up on this literature. There's the old stories which have risen up out of the suspicion of Catholicism, the predication of the Gothic novel and the modern novel. But to be honest with you, these stories about secret passages are seriously ancient anyway, and they are part of our cultural makeup. It's there in the Mabinogion. You can't get into the other worlds, the Celtic otherworld, without passing through a cave or a tunnel. It's there in the chronicled account of the Green Children of Woolpit in Suffolk, who are these two kids who are both green. They speak a foreign language that nobody can understand, and they appear out of a tunnel. And it's there in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, where the Green Knight lives in this lair, in this chasm within the ground. So we're kind of, I suppose, we're our cultural makeup wants us to believe in secret passages, but so many of them have this Catholic context to them as well. And I think that's why we're obsessed with monks and secret passages, because the suspicion is that the Catholics were up to something.
I think we have a few legends of, like, not necessarily tunnels, probably more passageways from caves along the coast, but they're always associated with smuggling, which I think would make sense, obviously, where I am on the northeast coast. And I think the funny one, we've got a legend of a tunnel that would have connected a pub that's no longer there called Burgoyne's, that would have connected it with St Andrew's Church. Now they were like spitting distance across the road from each other, so you can imagine the cellar of the pub and the crypt of the church actually being quite close underground. And that wasn't so that people in the church could go to the pub, it was the other way around. It was supposed to be so that people could then go and claim sanctuary in the church. And I've never known if it was true, because it sounds like it could be, but then you're like, or has someone just heard that somewhere else and then associated it with our church because everybody else has got one and no one wants to be left out?
I think that when stories sound like they could be true, that also helps their repetition and for people to then believe the unbelievable in many respects. Because most people, when they hear a story, they're not going to critically evaluate it in any great detail there and then. Most people hear a story, think about it for a couple of seconds, and they like it. It kind of, especially if it reinforces something which is already there in their worldview, that they will just accept it. And just move on, and it will get repeated and recycled and so on. So this idea that, well, we know that there was smuggling in the 17th, 18th, earlier 19th century. We know that that was a thing. Well, they must have needed secret access to bring the goods inland. Well, that kind of sounds likely then, doesn't it? But I always sort of defer to, and this is someone I know that you know as well, I always defer to Mark Norman on this issue, because he's really looked at underground folklore in Devon in particular. He wrote a whole chapter about it, subterranean folklore down there, and he looks at kind of smugglers' tunnels, and he was unable to find a physical reality to back up the stories at all throughout either of the Devon coasts. And if Mark can't find something that's real in the county where he lives, engaged in folkloric research, I kind of believe him there. And Mark points out simply that, to be honest with you, there's so much of the coastline of the British Isles which is so wild and remote. Why do you even need smugglers' tunnels riddling the landscape? You can just find a beach which is far away from the excise and bring it inland, and you'll be fine, to be honest with you. And that is principally what happened. There's no real need to tie yourself down to man-made infrastructure, which then runs the risk of being discovered ultimately. So, you know, if Mark was unable to find a genuine smuggler's tunnel in the entirety of Devon, I'm rather inclined to believe that they probably didn't exist. And that's just another sort of level, because again, we have got this storytelling tradition of subterranean spaces. Now, this is not to say that there aren't genuinely underground spaces at all in this country. We've palpably got loads of them. But when we actually archaeologically look at them and look at their functions, the idea of the secret access, it's quite rare, to be honest with you. We don't really have genuine examples of it, but what we do have is lots of water conduits, sewers, drains, basements, cellars, sally ports, and service accesses in castles. We have mines, siege mines as well, but, you know, extraction mines. We have all sorts of underground spaces which all serve a entirely prosaic and practical function, but with a kind of romantically inclined, misty-eyed, nostalgic, cozy view of heritage that we can start to imagine and misinterpret as the secret access tunnel or the secret escape tunnel. I think there's often a kind of a spark which will inspire the legend, and it might be something like a blocked door or a drain which has been broken into, and will then kind of reinforce the local folklore that certain buildings are connected. So there's often a spark based on genuine underground spaces. But to the best of my knowledge, in sort of 25 years of looking at these things, I've never genuinely encountered a real underground escape or access tunnel at all.
I think the thing that always makes me laugh when you think about things underground and you think just of London and the sheer amount of stuff that's under there. Like, first of all, how hasn't it sunk yet? And second of all, a lot of these spaces are less secret, more just forgotten, I think.
Yeah, yeah,
Which in a way still makes them super cool when people rediscover them, because then it's like,
yeah,
oh wow, we just forgot this was down here, which you almost don't need to invent something because just the very fact it exists
yeah,
is interesting enough. And I think what you were saying there about people hearing something and then taking it on because it chimes with something that they already think. I mean, we can cite numbers of news examples of where people have taken on a bit of misinformation and gone, that sounds like it must be true, and gone with it. And I think that often with a lot of this folklore, it is worth asking yourself, well, is this like just practical? Is this likely? Who would have built the tunnel? Because I'm thinking with the smugglers ones in the northeast, one of them, the smuggler just blasted caves out, and then it's now a pub. So he did actually dig caves out because it's sandstone. But as I say, it then became, I think he opened it as a pub because it was more profitable or something. So you do have to think, like with a tunnel, that's not an easy thing to build.
no.
So
Yeah,
how
there's a
practical
lot
is it?
of there's a lot of the practical application of this, because some of these tunnel myths are really seriously lengthy. Now, some of them it is just, well, it's from one building to the other across the road, and you might sort of think, well, that, as you said earlier, that could possibly be true. But I draw attention to one in my hometown in Staffordshire, Stone in Staffordshire, which, if it was real, as the mole burrows, would be 1.8 miles in length if it was dead straight. And it would have to go underneath the River Trent as well. And at that point, you've got to start asking questions such as, well, why do Augustinian monks need a tunnel to a secular manor house? How did they keep it secret? Who excavated it? How did they make sure that they kept it secret as well? Where did they put all the spoil? And then functionally, how was it kept ventilated? Because if you think of railway tunnels, they
And
all have
watertight.
ventilation shafts along them. And more importantly, when it goes underneath the River Trent, how do you keep it drained? Because surely that's just going to fill up with water. So there's all sorts of practical applications. And then some of these tunnels are even longer. So there's one that I draw attention to in the Suffolk landscape, which, as the mole burrows, would be 9.8 miles long from Framlingham Castle to Leiston Abbey. And that would go through 2 river valleys. And the longest one that I'm aware of is a rumour of a tunnel going from Scotland to Turkey. You know, some of these conspiracy theories almost are remarkable. So that, yeah, the sheer oddities of the practicalities of these spaces is something to really try and look at. But it never ceases to amaze me, and you alluded to this a moment ago, is how the mainstream media go for these stories, and the BBC in particular love a secret medieval tunnel. During the pandemic, Western Power Distribution, the energy people, claimed to have found a secret medieval tunnel near Tinton. And there was photographs of an underground space, stone lined and with water at the bottom of it. And, you know, they had broken through into something which is genuinely underground. But their press release immediately went for secret medieval tunnel. And obviously there's a kind of the idea lurking in the background that this was probably in some way connected to the monastery at Tinton, the famous monastery. And then this was picked up by the BBC, who repeated the press release with no critical evaluation at all. It took me about 25 minutes to work out exactly where the breakthrough had been, and to then go and look at what was going on in the Angithi Valley. And I found loads of evidence in a brilliant article for industrial revolution aspects of the heritage there, in particular with ironworks and wire manufacture. And there was a reference in one of the descriptions of one of the mills which produced wire in the 18th into the 19th century, that they didn't know how water was got to power this particular mill. Well, I'd say that now, as a result of Western power distribution, we absolutely know how they got water to that particular mill, because that is exactly where this water conduit was found, because that's what it is. It's not a secret medieval tunnel. It's an industrial revolution period water conduit to bring water directly from the river Angithi into the mill and to power the water wheels. And that should have been the result. As I say, it took me 25 minutes to find this, but most PR folk and most journalists want to go for the most outlandish, outrageous, esoteric, arcane, spooky interpretation of history that they possibly can to garner clicks to the website. Often, not in the case of the BBC, but often to justify the advertising revenue with more commercial journalism. But the BBC still want lots of people coming to their website, and they repeat so many of these stories. And yet, if you look into them for more than about 5 minutes, you'll find that there's a prosaic explanation as to what was going on here.
Mm. So where you do have sort of some debunking of things, like, and I'm thinking of like the stone graffiti stuff that you looked at in the book, is there a risk of ever accidentally devaluing something that is genuine by assuming it's the prosaic thing? Or are the odds always in your favor that it's actually going to be just something mundane?
Well, I think in terms of graffiti research, and I've done quite a bit of this over the last 10 or 12 years or so, I've looked at a lot of historic graffiti, from names and dates from the 18th and 19th century through to the genuinely medieval stuff, which tends to be pictorial in nature. Certainly when I started this, the consensus was that graffiti was usually the result of boredom or vandalism, that people were unnecessarily vandalizing historic spaces to make their mark, to say that they have been here, or that it was the result of bored kids or bored choristers in churches and that kind of thing. And that was really the interpretation. That was the scale of it, until we started understanding from what you might call big data, from large statistical surveys of either an entire building or a group of buildings in a region or at a national level, that there's actually way more interesting stories going on here. And we found, certainly with the earlier graffiti from the medieval period, from the early modern period, and even stretching into the 18th and 19th centuries, although becoming slightly less prevalent there, that something like 25 to 30% of mark making was connected to the need to drive away either evil or bad luck, witches, demons, evil spirits, that kind of thing. You start realizing that a quarter to a third of graffiti in that period was geared towards apotropaic function. Well, I think, that adds value, that adds significance to the interpretation. And I would sort of say that quite the reverse from this idea of debunking this idea that graffiti was just the result of boredom. We can actually layer in new interpretations which hammer straight home to psychologies and emotions, hopes, fears, desires. Also, the fact that we can see this at all levels in society, including working class history as well, is fascinating, because the thought processes of most working class individuals in the deep past are almost never represented in historic chronicles. When most working class people end up in the historic moments, because they've ended up in court. They've been a naughty boy or a bad girl, and they've been hauled into court, and we hear about their lives then. But it's the extraordinary moments. It's not the everyday. The thought processes and the concerns of individuals or even communities. So this idea that you can get into people's minds in the medieval period by recording graffiti and interpreting it properly, that it's not just boredom or vandalism, that there's actually something which is deeply significant, which is being recorded in a sense on the walls, I think adds value as a heritage asset to the reinterpretation of graffiti. So I think we've been able to change the story up there and actually make graffiti something which has actually become quite a popular element of the historic environment. So there's now lots of graffiti tours, which are either self-guided or somebody will take you around based on that research. Some of the stuff that I discovered at Knoll, for example, which is a country house near Sevenoaks in Kent, which I was able to sort of indicate may have been connected to a reaction to the gunpowder plot, and that this was some protective graffiti which was popped into a space which was being remodeled with the intention of providing accommodation for James I in the immediate aftermath of the gunpowder plot, may have been put there as a result of the state-sponsored propaganda to make sure that this building was protected from those hellish Catholics who have come up several times in our chat today. So that's now on display. That's part of the tour that the National Trust offer to their visitors, and the graffiti is even lit under a hinged floorboard. So we've been able to actively change not just the interpretation, but how visitors experience these sites through a fairly high level of research into graffiti studies over the last really 10 or 15 years.
I suppose in a way that almost links back to what you were saying before about the arrow grooves, how that was actually caused by people scraping bits off to use it as a magical cure. That again is speaking more to somebody's everyday concerns or whatever it is that they're hoping to do, because you get this a lot of plant folklore. That's hard to say. The fact that it's again, it's ordinary people's concerns and how they're trying to ward off bad luck or introduce good luck or whatever. And I think that it is quite interesting that these reinterpretations do allow you to revisit what regular people like you and me would have been doing several centuries ago, rather than just military people doing whatever it is that military people do. But that leads on to my sort of penultimate question. So there's two examples there where there's like almost like a mundane myth or type of explanation, but then there's also a magical apotropaic one as well. Are there ever any indications where it can actually be both of them, or does it usually end up falling in one or the other?
I mean, sometimes it can fall into one or the other, but there are occasions where something can be mundane and magical at the same time. And I suppose we've got to put ourselves into that mindset of the pre-modern world where magic and science are the same thing. And we kind of get this aspect, especially with burn marks in historic buildings, which I alluded to earlier, which used to be interpreted as accidental candle scorches. And this is the thing that the conservationist refers to me as a pratodemic with regard to. But we now know from extensive experimental archaeology, which I've either done or replicated myself, that these are deliberate human behaviors, that these tear-shaped blackened marks, some of which can just be a few millimeters high, some of which can be up to about a foot in height, can't be created accidentally, that they take serious energy to make, that you have to hold your taper or your candle at a 45-degree angle, that you can't really have any strong winds or blowing on it with your breath. It will sort of pull it out of alignment. That really these marks take about 10 to 20 minutes to create, especially if you want a nice deep burn mark. And also we know that where candles are left accidentally, they create a big, long, wide linear burn mark or a big amorphous blob, and your whole house burns down. And they don't quite leave these very discrete, very beautiful tear-shaped marks. So we know that this is deliberate human behavior. But because of the nature of graffiti archaeology, we also know that these are really bloody common as well. And that I can't really think of many houses that I've researched in the last decade and a half that don't have examples in them. They're just so unbelievably common, and they're found in all parts of houses as well. There are distributions around windows, doors and fireplaces because they were concerned about drafts and evil spirits coming in on the air, but they're also found on darkened staircases as well, or up in the roof structure, or in those sort of dark, spooky places in your houses, because there were other concerns as well. They were worried about dark spaces, because where there are dark spaces, dark deeds occur, or up in the roof, which of course is also dark. They're worried about fires starting as well, and that there was a concern that particularly demons, would bring lightning storms to set fire to your thatch. So it made sense to have burn marks up there to protect the house in all sorts of ways. And that actually these are a way of fighting fire with fire. They're almost like inoculations. This house has already been burned, so the big fire doesn't need to happen. So there's all sorts of different interpretations of these things. Sometimes they can be connected to purification and healing rituals as well. Sometimes we find them over the backs of where there would have been beds, for example. But of course, you needed protecting when you were asleep as well. They were worried about evil spirits possessing your body when you were sort of lying back asleep after having had 10 pints of mead or whatever, that your mouth would be lolling open and the evil spirit had come in. So they're always thinking about how to protect their buildings. But it's so common. I mean, I recorded a house about a year ago on the edge of Nottingham that had very nearly 200 examples of burn marks in the property. Now, that cannot be accidental. No. That's a lot of very stupid servants who how can you not know that this is a risk in a timber framed environment where there is this risk of conflagration? How can you be so careless? 200 in a not particularly large house. This is just a 3-bay hall house. It's on the bigger side of a hall house, but it's still a huge cemetery. If you go somewhere like Gainsborough Old Hall in Lincolnshire, I'm not quite sure how many there are there, but certainly hundreds, if not into the low thousands. That would warrant a good survey. I know that at Little Morton Hall in Cheshire, they've recorded something like 260, 270 of them in that great Tudor house. So these are hugely common, and I would actually say mundane, that it is just something that people do. Again, probably your granddad teaches you to do it. It might be a very private ritual as well, because we don't hear about these in writings of the period. They don't appear in diarized accounts or in things like Gilbert White's writings or anything like that. They just seem to be so unbelievably common that it's something that people are doing at all sectors of society. And that's from the Duke of Newcastle at Bolsover Castle, where we find burn marks on the window shuttering in his own personal chamber, all the way down to the parlours within yeomen's timber-framed houses as well. And it's everything in between. So I think the mundanity there is interesting because it seems to indicate that no matter who you are in society, you've got this fear of evil spirits, witches, demons, and you do something about it. And we can find that archaeologically. So there, I actually think that link between magical and mundanity really, really does express itself. The other thing that I like about burn marks, particularly in the context of the book, is that it's the one place where we can really see the strength of folklore actually helping to bolster the archaeological interpretation. Because although we can say quite a bit about these things in terms of their form and their distribution, it's the folklore which helps us to really nail the interpretation. The understanding that there were particular times of the year where you would use candles and tapers to drive away the threat of the witch, for example. This is recorded in poetry in connection with Twelfth Night rituals, or in the Catholic context, that there were times where tapers and candles were explicitly blessed and given power over the devil, such as Candlemas rituals. So again, the kind of the folklore comes into its own here. The reference in Merck's Festival, which is a document of the 1380s, which tells us that there was a particular fear of demons setting fire to buildings using lightning storms. Again, all of that folklore helps to deepen and broaden our understanding of the archaeology. So folklore and archaeology should not be opposites. It should not be two different disciplines. They can be pulled together very, very neatly to help enrich the interpretation of our historic built environment.
I'm just thinking as well that if you were using burn marks to try and ward off fire, and the building didn't burn down, you could almost argue, well, it must have worked then.
Exactly. So I've been touring this book, and I did a talk at the Mint House in Pevensey. She's just opposite what's now the main gate into the castle. And the building dates to somewhere in the middle of the 16th century. It's an absolutely fabulous place. And there, Joe Seaman, the chap that looks after the place, and he's another archaeologist who's looked into a lot of folklore himself as well, pointed out to me the stratigraphy of one burn mark at one end of the building, where there was genuine evidence for a real fire. There was scorching over the timbers in a particular area of the framing, and even the plasterwork had been scorched. But stratigraphically, the one burn mark in that region was over the top of the burning. And it's almost like, oh, bloody hell, we almost lost the building there. We'd better make it safe. So they put the burn mark over the top. And I found that tremendously compelling, because I can't think of anywhere else where I've seen such a, a sort of comprehensive relationship between burning and the burn mark. It was almost like the fear that could have really got out of hand and they lost the whole structure has led them to then put that burn mark on. I think that really helps to get into the heart of the matter.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I would be really dubious about doing something like that, but I'm pretty much a fire risk anyway, so that's probably for the best.
Well, if you
Um,
step out of this study where I'm speaking to you from now, and you go just down a small short set of steps, there's some exposed timbers in my Edwardian house where I've actually done some of the experimental archaeology. So this building dates to about 1900, 1910, something like that, and this is there to confuse future archaeologists, because I wanted to see what it would be like on old seasoned pine, or fir rather, and I'll tell you what, it doesn't half go up quick. If you use green oak, it takes 10 to 20 minutes. But if you put it on old softwood, you're talking a matter of seconds. So, there are some dangers to this.
Oh, I mean, I'm in a house from the 70s, and I don't really think plaster or UPVC will particularly do anything. I'll leave that one to you. So obviously you've mentioned the book, and I will obviously post a review of that as well. What's next for you, and where can people find you online?
Well, really, I mentioned that I've been touring the book. I did 31 dates over June and July, just immediately after the release of the thing in on the 6th of June. I'm now sort of working up the logistics for the next leg of the tour. I'm doing 40 dates, principally around England, starting at the beginning of September and running on to the middle of December. And then in 2025, I go again in January through to the end of May. So I'm really going to be touring this book for about a year. And currently we've got just slightly over, it'll be 90 dates in total. So I'm really fixated on that, actually, going out and communicating elements of the book, trying to actually localize some of these myths as well, because literally every part of the country has got these stories, and so I'm sort of rejiggering each talk and personalizing it and talking about the secret passage rumor in that town, or the burn marks that have been recorded in that particular building, or the arrow stones which are in the local parish church. So I'm trying to personalize it, so that's taking up quite a lot of my time as well. I've got another idea for a book floating in the back of my head, but I really do need to sit down and talk to the publishers about that, which I'm hoping to do as the tour progresses. So that's very much what I'm doing at the moment. In terms of where people can find me, I am readily available on Twitter and Instagram as JPW Archaeology. And I'd welcome contact from folk on there. And as is the nature of the job these days, I also have my own website as well, which features all sorts of information about the work that I do, some of the site reports that I've produced, and also the blog as well, which the book was originally based upon, the Medieval Mythbusting Blog. And that's available at triskeleheritage.com. So thank you for offering those links.
Yeah, obviously, I will put links in the show notes because it's a pain trying to sort of like feverishly write things down. So you can just click on things and that'll all be good. But like I say, it's been lovely talking to you. Obviously, it's going to be really interesting the next time I go into a historic building, how much I'm going to be like, that's not true, of the guidebook.
You have to be careful. You can really rub some curators up the wrong way. So you have to put it across in a very friendly and accessible and jovial way.
But it's been lovely chatting to you.
No worries. Thanks so much for having me on. It's been a real pleasure doing this one. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope that your listeners will get some pleasure and information from our natter and our chat.
I'm sure that they will. So I just wanted to include my review of Historic Building Mythbusting while we've been talking about it. And in the interest of transparency, I did receive a PDF copy, but what follows is my honest thoughts. And obviously that's why I can't hold up a copy to show you, because I don't actually have a physical one. Now, James debunks these 9 popular myths about historic buildings, including secret tunnels, which obviously we all know that I love here on Fabulous Folklore, the myth of spiral staircases turning a specific way to benefit right-handed defenders, which pub is the oldest in the country, etc, etc. Now, I knew that some of these were exactly that, myths, but yes, I was actually quite disappointed to discover some of them were myths, not because I was overtly familiar with them or indeed attached to them, but just because the myth in and of itself is actually quite cool. Now, it is a fascinating and at times even a gripping read, and it blends architecture, folklore, history and archaeology, and it basically ends up giving us a book which tells us a lot about who we are through what we believe, which is basically what folklore is really good at telling us in the first place. You will learn a lot about British history in the process of reading the book, and you'll learn a lot about specific locations so that you can have fun spotting the ones near you or indeed people you know. And in many cases the truth is weirder and often more interesting than the myth itself. I would advise that you go into it with an open mind and be prepared to let go of any cherished stories as you do so. I'm particularly thinking of the one about people assuming that stonemasons were hiding rude things in churches, like there's bits of carving and so on, as a way of thumbing their nose at the church. Be prepared to let go of that one. But remember what I always say with folklore, it relies on the both and. It's not an either or at all. You get to walk away both knowing the myth and also knowing the truth as well, which to be honest is a really important life skill. Being able to evaluate information and then coming to a conclusion based on what's actually in front of you, not what you feel, is really important. I do highly recommend the book, and I also look forward to reading whatever else James comes up with. So if you do want to read it, I have put a link in the show notes below so that you can go and find it. Enjoy. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.